successful. I'm now a retired software engineer. Went to Dartmouth College and got an excellent education there. I didn't quite graduate because I had some stuff left over after my senior year, and I got so involved in computer programming that I never finished it. But I got a very good education, which helped a lot. And in 1957, I got a summer job working for John McCarthy at MIT. And I wrote some Fortran programs on the very first release of Fortran. And in 1958, John offered me a full-time job at MIT, which I accepted, and I ended up working on the MIT Artificial Intelligence project and writing the first two interpreters that would process the Lisp programming language. And I continued working on the MIT and AI project, and in 1961, the Research Laboratory for Electronics down the hall received a PDP-1 computer, which had a display, which was remarkably inexpensive at the time, and was something that you could program. And my friends and I talked about what you could do with this, and we decided that you could teach people how to fly spaceships, and went on to generate a program called Space War, which some people like to call the first video game, although it's very difficult to defend that idea. And I went on to do other things, mostly in more serious computer business. And over the process of my career, I worked on 5 different video game Space War, and one other called Night Trap managed to get released. The others all got killed, which they deserved. One of my early hobbies was model railroading, and the Model Railroad Club at MIT, which I was a member of, was one of the contributors to Space War, as a discussion group at least. I worked on various other things, but always software projects. I retired several years ago, and now I'm still working on some hobby software projects and model railroading. Well, when I was growing up, I played Monopoly and various solitaire games, and I was always interested in model trains. I saw a model railroad at my uncle's place when I was 3 years old, and I never forgot it. And as I was growing up, I had a railroad running by in the back, well, not far away, and so I would watch the trains and look into the details of the railroad. That was during World War II, and at the time almost all the U.S. trains were powered by steam locomotives, and I've always liked them. And gradually I got interested in the building of railroads in the 1870s and 1880s, and that's one of the things I retain an interest in now. Well, I used to listen to radio shows of Superman and the like, and so I was quite familiar with them. Also, I read model railroading magazines or toy train magazines of various kinds, which I continue to do. When I had escaped from college and was working, I started reading science fiction. And one of the things that really impressed me was the Lensman series by Doc Smith. That provided an inspiration in some ways for Space War. Well, I'm not sure it qualifies as a video game now, but on my cell phone I have Clash of Clans, which is 3D display, sort of 3D display, isometric display, war game, and also solitaire. Sometimes when I don't feel like doing anything more constructive, I'll play solitaire until there's something gets done in the Clash of Clans, and then I'll go and deal with whatever happened in Clash of Clans and get things started again. Clash of Clans sort of qualifies as a video game, except it's on a cell phone, and I'm not quite sure whether cell phone games qualify as video games anymore. I'm always puzzled by the definition of video game, as you may have guessed. I like the idea of computers. When I was 11 or 12, my uncle, who was a Harvard professor, arranged a tour of the big computer at Harvard at the time, which was Harvard Mark I, which was a very mechanical computer. It had a 50-foot long shaft down the middle of it to drive everything. And I was quite taken with that. That was an interesting demo. And then I had this summer job doing Fortran, and that was fun. And then my senior year, I had in 1957-58, I had a rather boring class on great issues of the time, and so I wrote a machine language program for a Bendix or an LGP30 computer, and I didn't have one handy. All the data processing at Dartmouth at the time was done with cards. That was interesting. When I got the job at MIT, I had a course. I learned about machine language or assembly language programming for the IBM 704, which at the time was the largest scientific computer available. The Lisp interpreter that I wrote and revised was all done in 704 assembly language, and that ended up being something like 12,000 lines of code, most of which were written by somebody else, but there was still a lot of stuff, and debugging was remarkably painful by modern standards. But it was the only way you could debug computer programs at the time. That was actually one of the things about the PDP-1 that caught my attention. Was it had interactive debugging, so you could just sit at the typewriter and find out what your program was doing and make it stop before it made a mistake sometimes. which was a lot more entertaining and satisfying than working with stacks of numbers, which was the way you debugged programs with the 704. The original definition was more from chess playing, where a hacker was a derogatory term for someone who wasn't very good but was enthusiastic about playing, but didn't present much of a challenge. In the computer context, in the 1950s and 60s, it was more a kind of derogatory term for people who just tried things out and didn't follow them up and didn't seriously computer program. In the early part of computer development, there was a strong tension between purely mathematical background and computers as something separate from mathematics, or related but not exactly mathematics. And so the notion of a hacker was someone who just played around with a computer because it was fun instead of dealing with it seriously. I was sort of in both camps. Lisp was more or less serious mathematical approach to computers, and Space War was just plain fun and an interesting thing to try and see how it would work. Later on, the popular notion of hacker sort of split more predominantly between people who explored things that were easy to explore with computers, just out of curiosity, and people who took advantage of what they discovered and sold things and did various other disreputable things. Hackers in popular discussion became more evil rather than just people who explored. Difference in usage is still lying around. I claim to be an early hacker as an explorer. A lot of my friends were also explorers. Maybe I should use an example from Space War again. We started out talking about it with my friends, my roommates, and also people at the Model Railroad Club. And the idea started out as just, well, we could do something that would show people how spaceships worked, because it was clear that people didn't understand how spaceships worked. And the discussion went on, and it was pure discussion as to what would be, what you could do with the PDP-1 and its display that would actually work. So that continued, and eventually the idea of a trainer with a game to make the learning more interesting turned out to be something that looked relatively easy to do. And so I did it as what we would call a hack. But I put the results up as something that anyone could run on the computer, and I got lots and lots of suggestions. Things went on from there, but the initial thing might well be considered a hack, as it wasn't too much work, and it was a piece of exploration to see if it would work. And exploring a network when networks started to appear was also, or actually with the telephone network, was also something which hackers did. And in some cases, like Bill Gates, they actually figured out ways to get around paying for long distance calls, taking advantage of what information was available about how the telephone network worked, which was at least somewhat deplorable, and maybe horribly deplorable, depending on whether you were telephone stock or not. Well, the Model Railroad Club had a relatively extensive layout. I had been working on model trains, and so I had some, and I ran them. And I started collecting interesting locomotives, interesting models of locomotives. One of the problems which the Model Railroad Club had been working on basically since it was founded was how do you let several people run trains at the same time? They had a conduit to telephone company surplus, or Bell System surplus, and had built a system which allowed 5 people to control 5 different trains almost independently, and gave them a signal system, and it was all done with relays and signals. This was not an electronic computer. It doesn't meet the definition of computer very well, but it was certainly technical, and it turned out it was very much of the same technology that goes into making computers. And a number of the people who were at MIT and members of the Model Railroad Club became computer design engineers. The idea of electrical or electronic solution to the problem of running several trains on what seemed like the same track at once was susceptible to an electronic solution. One of the features of the Model Railroad Club solution was it was never quite perfect. And so there was always discussion of what could be done to make it better. Eventually, it got a complete revision, still using 1930s telephone technology. Then the club continues, and they have a website at MIT. And they had now, I believe, done 2 more revisions of that system. Tries to meet those requirements and have better, continuously improved solutions. It's a little hard to explain how similar it is to computer engineering, but it's not the same. Of course, now, if you want your little engine to make sound, you have to put a computer in it, and the manual for the computer and controlling the sound is considerably larger and heavier than the model. When I started at Dartmouth, my freshman year, I worked on the radio station, and the senior management at the radio station decided that my nickname was Slug, but they wouldn't tell me why, and so I don't know why I'm called Slug. But it was common when I was in college, and continued when I got out of college and moved to Boston. And it was common among my friends and relatives. And so it's my nickname. I don't know why. Alan Kotok went on to be a computer designer for digital equipment and manager for a long time. And he contributed, he made a remarkable contribution to Space War. when we got to the point of figuring out that we should make a spaceship simulator and so on, I kept talking this up, but my friends at the Motorola Club would say, well, why don't you do something? And I say, well, I didn't study numerical analysis, so I don't know how to write sine and cosine routines, and I clearly need them. Alan figured he could solve that problem, so he snuck out to Digital Equipment World Headquarters in Maynard, Massachusetts, a relatively easy drive from Boston, and got copies of the sine and cosine routine from the users group. And then he came and did a ceremonial presentation to me of the paper tapes with the sine and cosine routines on them, and said, here are your sine and cosine routines, Russell. Now what's your excuse? And there was an amused audience of friends. So I was sort of shamed into writing some code, and I decided, well, I had the sine and cosine routines, and now I had to figure out what to do. And I started seriously sketching out what the code had to be, and figuring out how long it would take. By today's standards, the PDP-1, although it was pretty fast for the time, was a very slow computer. So one of the major problems was getting things done in time to keep up a reasonably presentable display. And if you didn't get things done in time, the display started flickering, and it got pretty hard to watch. Timing was always important. Several different things that got me interested in it. One was the idea of a computer with a display was one that had been around for a long time. Many of the early computers had very early computers had displays. The ones that were obsolete when I started using computers. But the displays were always slow and expensive. And the PDP-1 display was not nearly as slow, and was, by standards of the time, was not terribly expensive. And the PDP-1 was sufficiently inexpensive that you could actually sit down in front of it and get it to use it all by yourself, rather than like the IBM 704, where you never touched the computer, at least if you were an ordinary user. You just submitted a card deck to the operators, and they, in the fullness of time, ran the cards and gave you whatever paper output your program produced. The only way you found out what was going on, was via paper, which you got typically hours later. There was the PDP-1 that was actually interactive, and you could debug and get many things done in an hour, which was typically the amount of time you could sign up for, unlike the IBM 704, where you got to do one thing a day, or maybe 2 days, if the computer was in demand. And so it looked like it would be more fun. Another thing was the space race, and spaceships and rocket ships were very much in the news at the time, because the Russians and the US were in this race to get people in orbit. And in 1961, which was when we started on Space War, Russians had gotten a man into orbit in January, and the US was still behind and didn't get a man into orbit into April. So it was a race, but the US was not yet ahead. and the Russians were winning. So there was the interest in space, and then I had been reading plenty of science fiction, and one of the pieces of science fiction which I had a great deal of fun with was the Lensman series by Doc Smith. And there, the heroes would typically just barely survive an attack by the forces of pure evil, would escape by running a super spaceship across the galaxy, pursued by the forces of evil. And they'd invent a whole new technology, or discover a whole new physical effect and invent a whole new technology to take advantage of it on the way across the galaxy, and get it working just in time to vanquish the forces of pure evil at the other edge of the galaxy. And it was a very big picture, and it was lots of fun, and it was wonderfully success at things that in the real world were a little improbable. And so this was an opportunity to sort of recreate some of that, or some of that feeling, and it seemed like it might work. Now, I note that hardly anyone has figured out a game that manages to go shooting across the galaxy, pursued by the forces of pure evil, and manages to let the player discover a whole new physical system and invent a whole new technology on the way. But it's still something that would be a lot of fun if you could figure out how to do it. Anyway, there were those three things, and it got into, well, what can you make the PDP-1 do along that way? And well, I could use the interactive debugging system if I had an idea of what I wanted to do. So if I wrote a program to display a spaceship on the screen and allow you to control it and have it move like a real spaceship, that was a plus. Given that I could do that, I could do it for two ships, and it turns out there was enough time to do that, just barely. There was this two-person game that was interesting. Then Dan Edwards, who I worked with on the Artificial Intelligence project, looked at my code, scratched his head a little, and figured out a way to revise my display system, my display program, so as to make it much, much faster. And that gave us enough time to calculate the effect of gravity, which was an ugly calculation on the machine because it involved 2 square roots per calculation, and you had to do that 10 or 20 times a second in order to keep the display going fast enough. And so he put that in, and that gave us enough time to calculate the effect of gravity on the 2 spaceships. So you had a sun there was a sun in the center of the screen, and 2 spaceships that were in orbit around it. And the orbits were reasonably realistic. Now, secretly, I didn't do a good job. I did a good enough job. I didn't do a perfect job. And so, if you could bring yourself to get your spaceship into orbit, and then took your hands off for a minute, lo and behold, it would go shooting off into the galaxy, which real spaceships don't do. However, people very seldom could bring themselves to leave their hands off for a whole minute, so it didn't matter much for the game, even though it's a deplorable piece of computer programming. So adding gravity made it a much better game. there was a problem with my explosions, and there was much tinkering with explosions because my explosions didn't look convincing. As usual, there was a problem in what does an explosion in space look like? And that's still around. That problem is still around, but eventually we got a satisfying version of it, and that made the game much better, or a little better. But the addition of gravity was really important, and that really made it a much better game. There was getting embarrassed into writing the code. Then there was getting a version without gravity that worked. And then there was getting a version with gravity that worked. And then there was incorporating all of the various improvements, like the improved explosions, and setting the pace to something that seemed satisfying, which was sort of the final, before the final, what I thought was the final release. And that's the version that got in the users group and the one that most people saw. It was the combination of all the features, and in the process of testing the release, Bob Saunders and I spent many hours playing each other, and so we set the pace, like how fast spaceships accelerate and that sort of stuff, to be something that we thought was a satisfying compromise between speed and accuracy. There was one extra advancement for that, which was I had always gotten suggestions for make it faster, make it slower, give me more torpedoes, give them less torpedoes. You ought to change these numbers. And I got tired of fielding them, and most of them I thought would make it worse. I assembled them all into one page that fit in one area of memory, and made the first page of the listing something you can look at and figure out how to change the parameters that people kept wanting to change. And once I made it easy to do for a user, people tried it a little and decided it wasn't worth the effort, and so they didn't use it much. But it solved my problem, which was getting all these suggestions. I could say, go read the first page and then change it to suit yourself. Shag Gretz gave a short talk at the DEC Computer Users Group in the spring of 1962, and we put the source code and the binary code, the executable, in the users group program repository, where anyone with a PDP-1 could ask the users group for a copy, and they'd get it. So it being the best demonstration program available on the PDP-1 at the time, probably for several years, almost all installations, all 50 of them, ordered a copy and used it to demonstrate that they had the latest in technology and what you could do with it whenever they had the public or VIPs around. So it got seen a lot in open houses, and eventually Digital used it at computer conferences for a couple of years. It got fairly widely distributed. A fair number of people saw it, remembered it, and then when they discovered that they had access to a computer that was similar to the PDP-1, but not the same, so they couldn't use it directly. They would figure out how to make a version that ran on their computer. And presumably that they found that to be almost as much fun as I did when I wrote the first version. And so there were a lot of adaptations running around. Then as the space race continued, programs like the Lunar Lander Simulator, which was a considerably more complicated job, became even better demonstrations of what you could do. And there were just lots more demonstrations, and Space War sort of ran out of common use, although a lot of people remembered it. Nowadays, computers are so fast that it's hard to make a simulator of the PDP-1 that will be as slow as a real PDP-1. And Norbert Landsteiner has made a web application that plays Space War, and he makes the special arrangements to slow his simulated PDP-1 down to the speed of the real PDP-1. And we've tested that side by side with the restored PDP-1 at the Computer History Museum, and the pace of Space War played on that simulator is just about right. He's also done a very heroic job of reading my code and writing explanations for each line, which I could never bring myself to do because it was so obvious. Anyway, he's done that, and he's done a great deal of research on other versions and stuff, and I recommend his website. Space War was never an official project of anything. It was a spare time project for me. It was a tolerated project for the PDP-1. The PDP-1 was in the Research Laboratory for Electronics, which was a piece of MIT, and since it was clearly research, well, it took only a small stretch of the idea of research. And Jack Dennis, who was supervising the RLE at the time, tolerated it. He tolerated a bunch of other projects that weren't obviously serious research, that like the assembler and the debugging system for the PDP-1, which turned out to be the foundation of the way you debug programs on a modern computer. And so it wasn't official, but it was tolerated. And then as a good demonstration, it got used and used and used. I claim it was the world's most popular computer game for a couple of years, but most of that was because it was the only decent one. And it turns out it was memorable, and lots of people remembered it. And given a different set of hardware, they tried to do something like it or something better. About 20 years later, it turned out, at the time, programs were considered worthless. And the patent office wouldn't allow a patent of a computer program. The copyright office wouldn't accept a copyright of a computer program. So there was no protection against copying, and nobody particularly worried about it. We thought about trying to sell Space War for about a week, but concluded that nobody would pay for it, which was accurate. So computer software was considered an expense, and the result was considered of a programming effort was considered worthless. And that was the way things were for something close to 20 years. And then IBM finally got sued by competitors, and one of the points in the suit about their monopolistic practice was they were giving away the software, and they had a much bigger library of software to give away than the competition, and that was deemed to be an illegal monopoly practice. And so IBM stopped giving away software and started selling it. And at that point, they thought about patents and copyrights and decided it was okay to copyright software or patent software. Now, that hasn't changed the fact that most software is still worthless. But you can at least now protect it so that if somebody wants to copy your worthless software, they can try. Or they can't try a literal copy. Then, as a consequence of this, when home computer games started, there was some further patent litigation. And so I got contacted by lawyers who wanted a deposition from me about Space War, because they were trying to establish that the idea of a computer game was prior art in a patent lawsuit. And so I finally got several good dinners from lawyers as a benefit for having written Space War. But that was when I realized it was worth something. The reason for doing things at night was that was when there was less demand for the PDP-1. And since you had the PDP-1 all to yourself to play Space War, as a matter of fact, one of the rules that got added at MIT was that playing Space War was absolutely the lowest priority thing you could do with a computer. So if I wanted to come in and debug a new version of Space War, that was more important than just playing Space War. I didn't realize that it was a pinball machine replacement until one time at Stanford, a couple of years later. I was working on various projects at Stanford, and we went out to a local bar to have dinner late, and came back to the PDP-1 that was installed at Stanford. I had to collect some stuff, and I saw a bunch of people come in and start playing Space War on that PDP-1, and I recognized that they had been playing pinball machines at the bar when I was having dinner. And that was the first time I really realized that Space War was something that could attract the same audience as a pinball machine. I know that Nolan played it and suffered from the usual desire to build something better, i.e. more, and demonstrated that you could actually make money selling something that would play Space War. I knew it was influential, but I didn't personally witness anyone terribly significant playing Space War. Computer space had a peculiar limitation They were aiming at manufacturing costs. And at the time, even building a computer out of parts was expensive. And so they didn't build a full computer. And that caused a number of compromises in the game, which made it not as much fun, I think. So while it sold relatively well to arcade game operators, in the scale of arcade games, it wasn't particularly successful because other games with a faster pace were more fun. Bill Pitts built a Galaxy computer game as an arcade game to compete with Computer Space, and he got one installation going sooner, and probably accepted the first quarter for an arcade game, for a computer arcade game, but he was using a deck computer, and even with a bunch of special efforts, it still wasn't cost competitive with arcade game platforms of the time. And then a little later on, Cinematronics introduced a platform which was actually a special purpose computer designed to play Space War, and turned out to be programmable so that you could make it play a whole bunch of other games. And that turned out to be a much more successful arcade effort than either Computer Space or Galaxy. You know, Nolan is a lot richer than I am, just in case you wondered. And there's a reason for that. He spent a lot of effort at selling the idea of computer games and arcade games, and he did an excellent job of it. And I just was playing with computers. I couldn't have put up with the selling effort, so I don't regret that he made the money and not I, because he had a particular talent and interest which I didn't have. One of the things that has became apparent as I worked on various other games, I sort of began to realize it when at Stanford, when we had a flight simulator program for the PDP-1 we had there, and that turned out to be accurate but boring. And it turns out that an airplane simulator that's realistic timing is kind of boring most of the time if you don't have something interesting to see out the window. And that's a much harder problem than just displaying a spaceship or just displaying the world at night, which was what the 3D simulator did. And there are lots of, I worked on a couple of other games that had the problem that they just plain weren't fun. And it turns out it's hard to translate a vision for what would be fun into something that actually is fun. And when you have a computer and a display to deal with, and a cost goal, it's even harder. As I said, I've worked on 5 game programs over the time, and only 2 of them made it to release, and one of them didn't deserve it and didn't make any money, but, well, the other one didn't make any money either, so I just wasn't in a good position to make money off computers. It turns out in 1951 there was a checker program, I believe, on EDSAC, which was demonstrable. but wasn't widely demonstrated and wasn't remembered by many people. A few years later on EDSAC there was noughts and crosses, which is tic-tac-toe in US language, noughts and crosses in English, which is a very simple game that isn't terribly exciting, but that was a two-person game displayed on a display and played on a computer. So that's one of the possible candidates for first video game. It's basically requires an awful lot of hair splitting and legalistic argument, and it's just not an interesting discussion to have. So I prefer not to defend any idea of what is first or what is a video game. Oh, there's also a problem with video game, and that is the definition has, surprise, surprise, evolved over 50 years. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. A volunteer group that organized itself at the Computer History Museum and wanted to restore a PDP-1 because the Computer History Museum had 2.5 PDP-1s, so it looked like restoring one wouldn't be too hard. And so I had volunteered, or I had stuck my nose in the Computer History Museum before, and they contacted me, and I sort of participated in the restoration effort mostly by email saying, oh yeah, we used to have that problem. So having participated in it when they actually got it working and had Space War running, we started demonstrating it around in the Computer History Museum and organizing how to present it to the public. And so I got involved in that, participated in developing a script for the demonstration, which nobody, including me, ever followed. But anyway, the idea was that without a script, you didn't have any clue as to what you were going to do, and with a script, at least you could figure out how long it took to do things, and prune your presentation down to the point where it would fit in people's attention spans. And so having worked on the script and being able to had it firmly committed to memory, then it was natural for me to help with the presentations. And we very quickly, well, in fact, we started out assuming that we would have two presenters, and assuming, because we correctly thought that having two people saying the same thing rather than one person droning on saying the same thing, having two people was more entertaining and kept people's attention better than having just one person. So we had pairs and we signed up, and I've continued to do that. The demonstrations have been interrupted, and the computer needs repairs before it can be demonstrated again. So I don't know how long that will take, but we should be back at demonstrating in a year or two. Well, I worked considerably on development of multi-user systems, computer systems, partly in the name of Artificial Intelligence Project at Stanford, and then later on with a company that tried to make a commercial multi-user system and didn't quite succeed. Then working for digital equipment in sales support. That worked for quite a while. Then I worked in just workaday computer programming for various companies and efforts. I note that with the exception of Intel, which was my last job before retiring, that was as a contractor, all of the companies that I've worked for are defunct. And all of the universities I've worked for, or colleges, are still alive and in great health. But it's in the nature of things that companies in the computer business come and go fairly rapidly. And I worked for a couple of different game startups over the years, and they have turned out to be, they all disappeared very rapidly, partly because the games ended up not being published or not being interesting. You need to get a picture from maybe MIT, but of an IBM 704 installation. And what it is a bunch of gray boxes the size of 1 or 2 or 4 refrigerators. So they're big boxes, and they're all gray, and they're sitting on a special floor, and what you don't see is a whole bunch of big cables going under the floor to connect all the boxes together. So you have this relatively big room, and you have all these boxes in it, and in the center, at the front center of the room, typically the rooms had one glass wall, so that you could have users and VIPs on tour who you could walk through the computer and see the computer, but not touch it. It also kept the noise in and the air conditioning in. And you had a heroic air conditioning system down in the basement and industrial power into all the boxes. At one corner of the room, so there's a computer console, there was a computer console in the center of the room where an operator pushed buttons and made things happen. There was also a card reader and a printer that next to the operator, so that he could control things by putting the right card deck in the card reader and find out what happened by looking at what was printed. And off in another corner of the room was another printer that was connected to a tape drive, and the tape drives were 1 refrigerator size and had magnetic tapes with reels that turned and turned and put on a good show. So they videotapes or movies of mag tapes turning are relatively common and available. Anyway, it would have mag tapes, and they were connected directly to the printer, so your typical run would run for a while, one for a minute or two, stop, the computer operator would load a card to dump what was in memory to a magnetic tape, and then take the tape off and put it on the offline printer tape so he could run the next job onto a different tape, and the printer could get around to printing it whenever its queue was empty. So it was typically done with 3 or 4 people in the computer room, one sitting at the console causing everything to happen and telling people what to do, and the others running around with card decks and magnetic tape. you would go down at MIT into the basement, submit your card deck to the operations staff down in the basement, and you could come back up and walk by the glass windows and see something going on, and hope what you saw was not somebody trying to fix the computer, but you see something going on, and you could figure out something else to do for another hour or two at least, and if you were a student, another day, while waiting for the printed output to come back. So the ritual was submit a card deck, wait, get your output, spend the output being a stack of paper about this high, which was all of the contents of the computer memory in numbers. And then you would spend typically a couple of hours looking at the numbers, trying to make sense out of how they related to what you were trying to do, and figuring out what you wanted to do next, which was typically change something and hope that you didn't get the same set of numbers this time. So anyway, that was the pace. It was very large, very slow, very impersonal, and not terribly reliable. IBM 704 was a vacuum tube computer. Now, vacuum tubes, under normal conditions, only lasted for a year or two for an individual tube. But when you had a few thousand of them, you typically had some sort of failure at least once a week, and frequently more often. And if you wanted a reliable computer system like the government air defense radar, you had to have at least two computers working, and hope that only one failed at a time, which was usually the case. So one of the things you could do when you walked by the glass wall was you would see if it looked like it was the computer operations staff or the IBM computer field service, the IBM customer engineers who were fixing it. Now, you could tell the customer engineers because IBM had a very strict dress code. They had white shirts and ties. And the operations staff didn't have nearly as strict a dress code. So they typically didn't have a white shirt, but they might have a white shirt, but they didn't have ties. And so it was pretty obvious when the computer was getting fixed. And you knew, if you walked by and saw that, then you knew we were going to have an extra long wait because the computer had been out of service for a half hour or longer. It was periodic excitement with the better part of a day of boredom. That this was a computer system that would typically be valued at several $1 million. And the PDP-1 only cost to buy $120,000. So it was much less expensive. And the idea that that it would be just one user and they would sit in front of it for an hour doing whatever they wanted to do was pretty radical, and looked to experienced computer hands with big computers as potentially a really wasteful way to use a computer. Turned out it wasn't, but that depended on computers getting a lot cheaper too. Here's a toy computer that I got recently. And I calculated its computing rate. It's 120 million instructions per second. Is more computing power than all of the installed computers in the world when I first got paid for writing a computer program in 1957. It's got more memory on it than any single computer, but it doesn't have more memory than was installed in the world, I think. That's what's happened to computers. And I think it costs $25. 2021 dollars, not 1961 dollars. In the late 1960s, I was working at Stanford University on a remarkable computer which was doing something that hadn't been done before. It was a big computer, well, fairly big, not quite as big as the biggest IBM ones, and it was able to run multiple users at the same time instead of one user, then the next user, then the next user, and so on. And running several at the same time, each one could have a terminal all by itself with a keyboard and a display. And this was quite interesting. We could do lots of things with it. We were working on artificial intelligence. And the company that made it, Digital Equipment Corporation, came up with a new version which was faster and more reliable and was believed to be suitable for commercial use. And the company in Seattle started up to sell time, fractions of a time on a PD-10 to anyone who wanted them for inexpensive computing on a big computer. And so I thought this was a great idea and took a job in Seattle helping make the time-shared computer available to anyone who wanted to buy it. And we worked hard at making it available to people and understandable. We had a school that was nearby that we offered computer time to. They had a terminal in the classroom, and the students in this high school started using our computer. And then we had a problem with this computer, it turned out, that while it did run multiple users, if it got a lot of users, it didn't run them for very long. After about half an hour or so, it would crash, and it would take us 5 minutes to get it work up and running again. So we wanted a way to test this without the embarrassment of doing it with paying customers. And so we offered the school the use of our room with terminals in it, there were about 8 of them, to do whatever they wanted to outside of normal business hours. And we said they could use all the computer time they could eat, and they could even try and crash the system. But if they did manage to crash it, they needed to tell us how they did it and not do it again until we said it was okay to try. And so Bill Gates and Paul Allen had found a way to crash the system. And we told them, yeah, that's fine, thanks very much. We'll work on it, and don't do that again. And a few days later, we found it was crashed that way again, and we did a little investigation and found, aha, the Lakeside school kids had been using it. And so we had to tell them very firmly, do not crash the system again until we tell you to. And they sort of grumbled, and we had to remind them a couple of times about the deal. But since we had the free computer time, and they did manage to remember that they shouldn't do it again. But they were learning things about the system, including how to crash it. And Paul Allen got very interested in it, and so I snuck him a couple of copies of the system manual so that he could learn more about it and do a smarter job of finding bugs, which he did. So we ended up being quite happy with that, and we did make the system better and more reliable, but unfortunately we didn't end up doing it fast enough. So after a year and a half or so, this startup turned into a shutdown. And I went off to work for Digital Equipment and do other things. And Bill Gates and Paul Allen finished high school and went on to college and learned a great deal more about computers and ended up writing a version of BASIC that actually fit on a small computer, a very small computer at the time. And that version of BASIC turned into Microsoft BASIC and was one of the ways that people learned how to use computers. A lot of people learned how to use computers. So that's the main story with Bill Gates and Paul Allen. They learned a lot, and I think that in fact they would learn something no matter what we did. But with a little care and guidance, we managed to teach them, to get them to learn some things that were useful. People ask me what achievements I'm proud of, and I must say that I should be proud of the fact that many of the things I worked on turned out to be interesting and satisfying. And there were two things that stick out in my memory as things that had never been done before. There's the Lisp implementation, and there is Space War, which was the first video game. People like to call it the first video game. It wasn't the first by almost any definition, but it was the first time there was an interesting game that people came to play again and people remembered. And I'm pleased to note that people still remember Space War, and when they have an opportunity to play it on the restored PDP-1 at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, or on the browser implementation that Norbert Landsteiner did, which is an accurate simulation of a PDP-1, which plays Space War. When I escaped from Dartmouth College in 1958, I got a job at the MIT Artificial Intelligence Project, which was just starting up. And John McCarthy and Marvin Minsky were running the project, and John was very interested in making it easier to write programs that dealt with symbols like mathematical formulas. And he had some ideas about what a mathematical sort of language would look like, and started writing them down and telling us about them. And we started learning ways to turn these ideas into computer programs. And it turned out that it was a very mathematical sort of notation, so I had already dealt with Fortran, and so it seemed very simple to hand compile it, look at the code, and convert it into machine language, or actually assembler code, and get a program that did what was written down in the mathematical notation, which John McCarthy started calling Lisp. So in the fall of 1958, John figured out that he could write an interpreter which use it in this language, which would interpret the language. And I looked at that, and that was just using the sort of thing that I had been hand compiling as tests and examples for the last month or two. And so I said, oh, I can write that. And John, I'm not sure exactly how much encouragement I got from John and how much I bulldozed my way into it. But anyway, we ended up more or less happy with me sitting down for a couple of months to write this program, which would take this symbolic notation of Lisp for handling symbols and mathematical formulas. And Jim Slagle, who was a grad student working for John, learned Lisp and started writing something to do something that was involved in sophomore calculus, namely formal integration at the time. And so he started explaining to us in seminars how he proposed to do it. And several of us who had worked on the interpreter and had understood how it worked sat in the back of the room and listened to what he wanted to do. And we said, we were very rude. We said, oh, that won't work right. That won't do what he expects. And so we argued about it and thought about it and decided that, well, what he expected was the right thing in the sense of mathematically neat and not surprising. And we really ought to change things so as that it would. So the next year, the beginning, in the winter, 58, 59, I rewrote the interpreter that I had written again with some changes to make Jim's program work in a reasonable way rather than the way it happened to get treated with the program the way it was. And that turned out to be a permanent feature of Lisp. And Jim was happy and got his degree. And I wrote a Lisp implementation, which had never been done before. And Jim Slagle managed to write a program which did what sophomore college students, math students, learn to do in class, and do it automatically and correctly, and do the sign, make sure that all the signs worked out correctly. A challenge which I never mastered. So that was a bunch of stuff which had never been done before and which I helped with. And it was like most things in computers. It wasn't something that was done single-handedly by a hero, but it was done with a thoughtful group cooperating and helping each other with various pieces that they understood. I'm asked, what do I recommend for young computer programmers? And I have a couple of things to try. One is, you will find that it pays off to learn or to read manuals. Now that requires a considerable amount of persistence, and not all manuals are clear, but you have to keep trying and ask questions and try to get to understand what the manual has to say. The other thing, I would recommend, if you can, learn English or Chinese or German or some other language other than your own that people write about computer stuff in. So another thing which has caused me program grief more than any other thing is a lack of craftsmanship. There's a certain amount of neatness and consistency which makes programs a lot easier to understand, a lot easier to change, and a lot easier to understand and improve. And some programmers that I have cleaned up after never learned that, and worse yet, they seldom, if ever, solved the same problem in the same way, even though they had already done it well. And it's like building furniture and finishing it. You really want to make it neat and good looking so that people appreciate it and like it and find it satisfying to deal with. And ugly, sloppy code is just ugly, sloppy code. And it's painful to deal with. Don't write it. Hello to Video Games Party friends. I wish you good luck and to have fun with computers and games. And if you feel a little adventurous, try writing a game or 5. It's fun.